Welcome back. In the previous video, we enhanced security and performance with tweaks to the Nginx configuration. In this video, we're going to walk through the steps required to migrate an existing WordPress site to a new server. There are a lot of reasons you might want to migrate a site. The most common is that you want to move from one web host to another. I've got a website up here, daveswift.com. This is on a separate server, and what we're going to do in this video is move it over to the server that we've been working with. That's the pluto.daveswift.com server. So even though this says daveswift.com, it's obviously a template website. This isn't mine. It's got someone else's information on it. And my goal throughout this video is to move it over to the server that we've been working on. Now, before we get started, I want to say that if you're moving a site to a server that you've already set up with SpinUp.wp, the following guide is going to work, but you probably shouldn't use it. You should go over to our documentation on migrating a site to a SpinUp.wp server. That's going to give you a lot more specific instructions, and honestly, it's going to save you a lot of time and headaches. Another good reason to migrate a site is to retire a server. I don't recommend upgrading a server's operating system. That is, I don't recommend upgrading Ubuntu, even though Ubuntu might tell you to do so. The truth is that a lot can go wrong when you're upgrading the OS of a live server. Just think about all that downtime while you install the operating system. It's just not worth the trouble. A much safer approach is just to spin up a fresh server, migrate existing sites, and then shut down the old server. This approach allows you to test everything to make sure it's working before you switch the DNS and direct traffic to it. Now, if you haven't already completed the previous video so you know how to fire up a fresh server, you should start at the beginning. If you're interested in a super quick and easy way to provision new servers that are tuned for WordPress hosting, well, make sure you check out SpinUp.wp, the actual product. That's how it works. All right, now let's get started moving our site. Before we begin migrating files, we need to figure out what the best way to copy them over to the new server is. There's a couple methods we could use. The one you're already familiar with is probably FTP, but the safest and quickest route is actually something called SCP. SCP allows us to copy files server to server without having to download them to our local machine first. Under the hood, SCP is just using SSH. So in order to connect our two servers together, we're going to need to create a new SSH key so that we can connect the source server to the destination server. Let's go ahead and get logged into our destination server. For me, that's going to be the server that we've been working with throughout this series, and we'll create a new SSH key here. I'm going to head over to the written version of this guide, and under securely copying files, the first command is going to help me create that SSH key. I'll copy it, paste it in, and I'm going to go ahead and save it in the default location. I didn't add a password there, but you certainly could if you wanted to. Next, we're going to need to copy that key to our clipboard so we can actually paste it in over on the existing server or the source server. To do that, we'll head back to the written version of the guide and we'll grab this second command right here. Copy, back over to the terminal window, I'll paste it in. Now here is my SSH key. I want to grab everything from below that initial command that I just pasted in. We'll grab everything from here all the way down through the server underscore IP or host name. Now I'm using a clipboard manager to save this, but if you're not, you might want to go ahead and paste this into your text editor just so you have it nearby. Next, I'm going to connect to the source server. This is the existing server that we want to transfer the website from. I'll add a new tab here. All right, now I'm going to SSH into my source server and add that public key. We'll head back over to the written version of this guide and we're going to grab this third command down here. This will allow us to add our public key that we just created to our source server. Now we're going to open this up inside of a text editor because inside of these quotes, we need to replace the public key with our actual public key. So let's head back over to our terminal window here, and you probably still have it up. Here is my code. If you didn't save it in a notepad, you can probably still get it on your terminal window. We'll head back over to the notepad and paste it in. Now I'm going to select everything and go back over to not my destination server, but my source server, and I'll just paste in this command. Now we want to test it out. Can we connect from our destination server to our source server via SSH? So I'm going to go back to the destination server, and let's try to SSH into our server. There we go, we're in. Now, if you're unable to connect, just go back and verify all of the previous steps before you continue on through this video. All right, let's get started with the file migration so that we can move any WordPress files as well as any files that have been uploaded to the root directory of the old site, the old server. We're going to move those over to our new server with a simple command. Head it over to the written version of this guide. Right under File Migration, I'm going to copy this command and open it up in our text editor. We want to make some substitutions to this command so that it has our source server's IP address as well as the website root folder. So for me, that's going to be Dave, and then I was using an IP address here. Then I'll update this with the domain name that I'm moving and the domain name here again. All right, I'm going to copy this, head back over to my terminal window, and I'm going to connect to my destination server. Let's go ahead and paste in this command. And just like that, the files have started transferring from the old server, the source server, to our destination server. All right, with the files taken care of, it's time to add the site to Nginx. Now, there are a couple ways we can approach this. We could create a brand new, fresh configuration based on the steps we took in video 3 of this series, or we could simply copy the configuration over from the old server. Now, I recommend typically copying the existing configuration, as you know it works. However, starting fresh can be useful, especially if your virtual host file contains a lot of redundant directives. Now is a perfect time to point out that in the last video of this series, we'll be downloading a complete Nginx configuration kit so that you can go ahead and get started right away. You could grab those for your new server if you want, otherwise follow along. In this example, I'm going to copy the existing configuration. Just like we did with the site data, I will copy the files using SCP. Now to get started, we have a little bit of setup to do. I'm going to type ls, which will show me a list of all of the files in my home directory. You can see I have 2 sites set up here, the one we created earlier in this guide, as well as the one I just migrated over, daveswift.com. Let me go ahead and navigate into that folder. I'll type cd daveswift.com. And then I'll do another ls here to see the files inside. You can see we've got our logs folder as well as our public folder. If I were to open up the public folder, we would be able to see all of the WordPress files here. All right, I'll type cd ... to navigate one folder out. Now, really what I want here is just another folder where I can place my configuration file so that I can easily move it over into my home folder before navigating it over to the more protected directory where it's supposed to live inside of the Nginx folder. I'll go ahead and just type mkdir sites-available. All right, now if I type ls, you can see I've got my new folder created. Heading back over to the written version of this guide, I'm going to grab this first command under Nginx configuration. Of course, I'm going to paste it in over inside of our notepad. I'll update it with my username and my source IP address. And of course, I've got to update the URL here. And I'll update this, but then of course, I also want to add in that file path that we just added, which was sites available. Now, the reason for this is we're going to be moving a configuration file called daveswift.com into a folder also called daveswift.com. So there's obviously going to be a little bit of a conflict here because we'll have 2 files with the exact same name. So I'm just going to go ahead and add this extra path that I'll be able to remove later. So I'll copy this, go back over to our command line, paste it in. There we go. Our file has moved. Now, if I were to navigate into that sites-available folder and do an ls here, I can see the configuration file is right there. All right, our next step is to move this configuration file into the right place and then to make sure the root user owns them. Back over to the written version of the guide, we're going to grab this command right here. We'll paste it in, update all of our directories here, select all, back over to the terminal window. Now I want to make sure that I perform this command inside of this temporary sites available folder that I've created inside of our website. I'll go ahead and paste this in. All right, great. So the file has been moved. If I go ahead and do an ls here, you see there's nothing inside of this folder. All right, then I'm going to do cd ... and I'm actually going to remove that folder altogether. There's no reason to have it around. rm-rf will remove a folder. Then I'll type in the name of the folder and return. I do an ls here. I just have my logs and public folder the way it should be. All right, the last step in our Nginx configuration migration is to symlink the virtual host into the enabled sites directory. If you remember inside of, I believe it was video 3, we did this in setting up our initial site. So let's go ahead and head back to the written version of the guide. Here is our command to create the symlink. I'll copy this, paste it into our text editor, and update the directories. Select all, copy, and paste it back over into the terminal window. Now, before testing if our configuration is working, we should copy over our SSL certificates. Certificate file permissions are more locked down, so we're going to need to SSH into our source server and copy them to our home directory first. Back over to the written version of the guide, first command under SSL certificates will copy and open up in our text editor. Again, updating our domain, copy, and then over in our terminal window, we're gonna have to connect to our source server, our old server that we're moving from. Let's go ahead and connect here. Now we're gonna paste this command in. Remember, what it's doing is grabbing the SSL certificates from their more protected directory and then moving them to the home directory so that we can easily move them later on to our destination server. Paste this in. Next, we wanna make sure that our SSH user has read and write access. Back over to the written version of the guide, copy the second command right here over into our notepad, change the user, copy, and paste into our terminal window. Go back over to the guide and grab the command to actually copy those SSL certs from our source server to our destination. Paste this into our text editor, update the information. Again, this is going to be your source server. Copy the command when you're set and paste it into the terminal window. All right, just like that, the files were moved over. We're going to generate fresh certificates using Let's Encrypt once the DNS has been switched over later on in this video. But for now, we're gonna leave the certificates in our home directory. So let's go ahead and update the Nginx configuration to reflect their new paths. Over in the written version of the guide, let's go ahead and copy this command right here. It's about the fourth one down. Open up our text editor and paste it in. We'll update the domain, of course. Copy this back over inside of our terminal window. I'll end up pasting in that command. And we're going to need to update a couple of directives here. First is the SSL certificate directive. We're just going to have to update this directory. Go ahead and delete everything right here and type in our path to our username. There we go. Then under the SSL certificate key section, we're going to do the same thing. Go ahead and remove everything. And we'll add in our path here. All right, with this updated, we want to check and make sure we don't have any other server blocks. I know on this configuration I do because I have a server block for the www version of this as well. So I want to make sure I update both of these server blocks to have the correct location of my file path. So let's go ahead and remove everything here once again, and I'll update with the correct file path and repeat down here for the SSL certificate key. All right, once everything looks good, go ahead and press Control X to exit and yes to save, and then a quick return to bring you back to the command line. To confirm the directives that we've just changed are correct, let's go ahead and test the Nginx configuration. Sudo Nginx-T. Looks like everything is good, so let's go ahead and reload Nginx. Sudo service Nginx reload. Now let's spoof some DNS. It's a good idea to test the new server as we go. So what we can do is actually spoof our local DNS to make sure that the old server remains active for our site's visitors, but then we can test the new server without having to impact anything. So on our local machine, we're actually going to make a few changes. I'm going to pull open a new terminal tab here. All right, right from our local computer's command line, we're going to type cd/, that'll bring us right to the root folder here. I can pull ls, you can see the file structure. It looks very much like we're connected to one of our servers. This time we're going to navigate into our local etc folder by typing cd etc, and we want to edit a file called host. So I'll type nano. Oh, you know what? We probably should do this as sudo. So we'll type sudo nano hosts. Enter our password. Now, once this file is loaded, there's a very simple change that we need to make to spoof the IP address. We'll go ahead and paste in our destination, our brand new server's IP address, paste that in there, and then I'll leave a space and I'll simply type in the domain name that we're trying to spoof. So in my case, it's daveswift.com. I'll go ahead and hit Control X here, Y to save, and we have now successfully spoofed the IP address of our domain. Now, before continuing, I want to point out that the domain now points to the new server's IP address. If you typically SSH into the server using the host name, this is no longer going to work. Instead, you're going to need to use the IP address for each server until the migration is complete. Next up, database import. Before we can perform the import, we need to create a database and the database user. On the new server, or the destination server, let's log into MySQL. We want to use the root user here. I'll type mysql-u root-p. Enter in our password. Then let's head over to the written version of the guide, and we're going to get some commands here to create the database. I'll paste them into my text editor so I can update them with the proper names. All right, let's grab this. We'll paste this in. This actually creates the database named Dave_Swift. Back over to the written version of the guide. Copy this next block here, paste it into our text editor. We're going to add a username and a password. Obviously, you should use something that's actually secure. We'll update our database name right here to match the same database that you just created. And once again, we want to update our username to whatever you used over here. Select all, and we'll paste this into MariaDB. With that taken care of, it's time to export the data. We're going to use MySQL dump to perform the database export. If you need to do anything more complex, like exclude post types or perform a find and replace on the data, I would recommend using WP Migrate Database Pro. To export the database, we're going to need to connect to our source server, or our older server. Let's go ahead and do that now. Now, if we head over to the written version of this guide, we're going to find another command right here on how to move the actual database. Let's go ahead and copy this, and we will paste it into our editor. Now, we're going to have to replace DB user and DB name with the actual credentials that are found in our WP config file. Let's go ahead and check those out. I'll navigate to our home directory here. All right, here is our website that we are trying to move. So let's go ahead and open up that. All right, we're inside the public folder. And if I take a look here, this is the WP config file. I'll open this up with the Nano editor. And here's the information we need. DB name is daveswift_com. Let me copy this over into our command. And DB user is just Dave. All right, let's copy this. We'll go back to our command line. Exit out of that editor. We don't need to actually make any changes. I just wanted to show you where to find that information in case you didn't know where it was located. Let's go ahead and paste in our command here. All right, so when issuing that command, you're going to be prompted for your password. Now, you probably will do what I did, which was enter the password in for the server. If you have a root password for your server, that was a mistake. Really, what you want to do is enter in the password for the MySQL database, which makes a lot more sense. All right, now we're going to switch back to our destination server or our newer server and actually transfer the database files. Let's head over to the written version of the guide here, and we're going to go ahead and go down to this next command right here. We'll copy this and paste it into our text editor. I'll update the username and the IP address. All right, grab that command, back over to the terminal window, and paste it in. Great, now the file has been moved from the old server over to the new one. With the database successfully transferred over from the old server to the new server, it's time to import the database. Over in the written version of the guide, we've got one more command down here before it's time to test. Let's go ahead and copy this, go over to our text editor and paste it in. Once again, we're going to have to update our database user and our database name. Select all, paste it into the command line, enter our password. Again, this will be the MySQL password. All right, and we should be good to go. If any of the database connection information is different on the old server than it is on the new server, of course, you're going to need to open up that WP config file and make any changes so that everything is accurate. Without further ado, let's go ahead and open up our site here. And sure enough, it is loading correctly. So we have safely migrated the site from the old server to the new server. But remember, this is not live because we still have the spoofed DNS. Because the DNS is spoofed, this is the perfect time to check that everything is working correctly. For e-commerce sites, you should confirm that the checkout process is working and any other critical paths you might have. Remember, this is only a clone of the live site. So anything saved to the database won't persist as we'll be re-importing the data shortly. Once you're happy with everything working as expected, it's time to perform the migration. Here's how you can migrate with minimum downtime. On busy sites, it's likely that the database will have changed since we performed the previous export. For us to ensure data integrity, we need to prevent the live site from modifying the database while we carry out the migration. To do that, we've got a few actions to perform. First, we'll update the live site to show a back soon message. Then we'll export the live database from the old server, and we'll import the live database to our target or new server. Then we'll switch the DNS to point to the new server. All right, let's get started. To stop the live site from modifying the database, we're going to show a back soon page. Over in the written version of this guide, we've actually got some HTML that we can just copy and use as a page. Copy this. We'll connect to our old server. Then inside of our site's public folder, I'm going to type nginx.html. Here, I'll just paste in the contents of that back soon page. Command X to exit, save, and enter. Now, still on the old server, we need to modify the site's virtual host file. Let's copy this command right here. Open up our text editor, update the URL, copy this, back over to our command line. Again, this is on the old server or the source server. Paste this in. Now we want to make sure that our index directive has the index.html in it. So let's go down here. We'll add a little space, type in index.html before the .php. That's very important. Command X to save, Y, and return. Then let's reload Nginx. All right, now our live site should be down. If we're using Nginx fast CGI caching, any cache pages will continue to be served from the cache. However, requests to the admin-ajax.php and the WordPress REST API will fail. Therefore, we will not be able to use plugins such as WP Migrate DB Pro to perform the migration. Now, before continuing, you probably want to make sure that your live site is indeed showing the back soon page by checking it maybe from your mobile phone that's not connected to your Wi-Fi network. Or you could just remove the spoofing entry that we added to the host file on our local machine that we added earlier. All right, it's time to flip the switch. The live site is down, so let's export and import the database one more time the same way we did before. That way, any changes that occurred since we did the database testing will be migrated. However, this time we won't need to create a database or a database user because that's already done for us. So back over in the written version of the guide under database export, we'll go down to the fourth command, which is to export the database. Let's copy that, paste it into our text editor, update it with our username and our database name, copy it. And back over on our source server, I will paste in that command one more time. Let's grab the next command down, which is to copy the database from our source server to our destination server. Let's open this up in our text editor, update it with our credentials, select all. Back over in our terminal window, we want to make sure we're on our destination server, not the source server. Paste this in. Great. Now we have a fresh copy of the database. Finally, we need to import the database. We'll grab this final command here, paste it, update our user and database name. Copy, paste it in, enter our MySQL password. All right, with the spoofing still in place, I can go ahead and check out my domain, make sure everything is still connected up here properly. It looks like it's working just fine. Definitely give it a thorough run through, check all of those important pages, and then we're gonna go ahead and change the DNS on our DNS control panel. So here I am inside of our DNS control panel. I'm gonna update the A record here, paste in our new IP address, and we'll do the same thing here for the www. I want to mention this TTL section over here, which is time to live. You're generally going to want to use the smallest denomination possible on my Namecheap DNS provider. That is 1 minute. That means that most users are routed to the new site very quickly when we make a DNS change. However, if your TTL is a bit higher before you make this change, I'd recommend changing it actually a few days prior to the migration. This will ensure that DNS changes propagate more quickly to your users. For now, I'm going to leave this on automatic. All right, so the modification we've just done to the DNS records will start routing traffic to the new server. However, keep in mind that DNS queries are cached, so anyone who has visited your site recently will still be routed to the old server and potentially see your back soon page. Once the user's machine re-queries for their domain DNS entries, they should be forwarded over to the new server. All right, I'm inside of my host file here on my local machine. I'm going to go ahead and remove that spoof. Control X to exit, Y to save, hit return. All right, now that the new server is live, there are a few loose ends that you'll want to take care of, but fortunately, we've already covered these in previous videos. We want to add a Unix cron. We should ensure that automatic backups are running. And finally, we should generate a new SSL certificate using Let's Encrypt. That's everything there is to know about migrating a WordPress site to a new server. If you follow the steps outlined here, you should have a smooth migration with very little downtime. In the next video, we'll cover how to keep your server and sites operational with ongoing maintenance and monitoring.